Now, by 1845, Texas has decided they want to join the United States and become a state. Right? Before 1845, between 1836 and 1845, they were completely separate. They were their own country. But by 1845, their population has reached 150,000, which is more than enough to claim statehood. And so they appealed to the United States government that they want to become a state. Now, President Andrew Jackson said yes, but the senators and congressmen say no because it's a slave area, right? And they don't want to bring another slave state into an area and disrupt the balance that is in Congress and Senate. So they're forced to stay independent. But there's just enough support in Congress for its admission if there's a couple senators to switch from the North, right? So what Texans start doing is they start to talk to the British Empire, and this makes America very nervous. And so that convinces enough senators from the North that to admit Texas as a state. So in 1845, Texas can be admitted as a slave state into the Union. So there are several Southern senators who want to break Texas into several states, right? That will give you more power in the Senate. You'll have more senators who are slave, right? But others worry that this will provoke war with Mexico if it's brought in as a state, especially if it's brought in as several states. So Southern politicians look for a candidate to bring Texas in, right? And they turn to a man named Polk. He's nicknamed Young Hickory. He's another former governor of Tennessee. And President Polk barely wins the election, right? And he mostly wins because abolitionists vote for third party candidate, which means that Van Buren doesn't win. Now, Polk decides that Texas can be admitted, and he puts the boundary of Texas at the Rio Grande. So Texas is annexed in 1845, right? Congress declares it's part of the United States and brings it into the Union. This makes Mexico very unhappy, right? They see Texas as basically a rebellious province, although they probably would have let Texas go if the border was at the Natchez River. But they're claiming that the Texas boundary is the Rio Grande River. So to bring in Texas, Polk has decided that Texas can come in as a slave state as long as we bring in Oregon in as a free state, right? Now, Oregon is owned, slightly shared with Britain, right? And the idea is all of the Oregon territory should become part of America, and Polk wants it at the 5440 parallel line. You can see that at the top of the map, right? That all of that should become American, right? And there's a slogan which is 5440 or fight, right? We'll take all of it or we'll fight Britain. They end up compromising and taking half, which becomes Oregon and Washington, and Britain gets to keep British Columbia. But he does this to sort of help grease the wheels to bring in Texas, right? So Polk decides it would be popular for his presidency if Mexico is attacked, and they bring in all of the Texan region, right? So here's a quote from him and his message to Congress on May 11th, 1846. He writes, "The grievous wrongs perpetrated by Mexico upon our citizens throughout a long period of years remain unredressed, and solemn treaties pledging her public faith for this redress have been disregarded. Our commerce with Mexico has been almost annihilated. It has been formerly beneficial to both nations, but our merchants have been deterred from prosecuting it by the system of outrage and extortion which the Mexican authorities have pursued against them, whilst their appeals through their own government for indemnity have been made in vain. We have been exerting our best efforts to propitiate Mexico's goodwill. We have tried every effort at reconciliation. The cup of forbearance had been exhausted even before the recent information from the frontier of Del Norte. But now, after reiterated menaces, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon the American soil. She has proclaimed that hostilities have commenced and that the two nations are at war. As war exists, and notwithstanding all our efforts to avoid it exist by the act of Mexico herself, we are called upon every consideration of duty and patriotism to vindicate with decision the honor, the rights, and the interests of our country." So Polk sends troops to the Rio Grande to defend the incursions of Mexicans on Texas territory. Of course, what he's arguing is that the Mexicans have invaded America by crossing the Rio Grande, and attacking Texans there, while Mexico is really sending troops into this area because they see that as part of Mexico and that the real line is at the Natchez River, right? So Mexico is fighting these troops, and it's not clear, right, whether this war is taking place in America or in Mexico, right? Polk declares war, it's still not clear. Is Mexico invading America, or is America defending themselves? Or is the United States invading Mexico because now Polk has sent troops down into what he sees America and what the Mexicans see as Mexico, and is Mexico defending itself, right? It's a very confused war, and the U.S. Northerners are not happy with this war. They see it as part of American greed, right? Ulysses S. Grant said this is one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger nation against a weaker nation, right? The United States is starting to act like a European monarchy rather than a democratic republic. It's starting to act like this sort of power-hungry, land-hungry empire. And here we have Henry David Thoreau on civil disobedience, right? This is one of the things he writes when he talks about an individual should have the right to protest an unjust war. And when he means protest an unjust war, he says an individual should have the moral right to say, my country is not doing the right thing. I'm not going to pay my taxes to a country that's doing bad things, right? I have the right to not pay taxes for unjust war. Of course, he ends up being taken to jail for that, and that's where he writes this tract on civil disobedience. On civil disobedience becomes one of the rallying cries for pacifists from history that forward. So people like Gandhi, Martin Luther King read on civil disobedience and take a sort of a note from his book about how a weaker power, how an individual can fight against a broader nation. So this is the end of a section on civil disobedience. The authority of government, even such as I am willing to submit to, for I will cheerfully obey those who know and can do better than I, and many things even those who neither know nor can do so well, is still an impure one. To be strictly just, it must have the sanction and consent of the governed. It can have no pure right over my person and property, but what I concede to it. The progress from an absolute to a limited monarchy, from a limited monarchy to a democracy, is a progress toward a true respect for the individual. Even the Chinese philosopher was wise enough to regard the individual as the basis of the empire. So he's saying, I as an individual have the right to say yay or nay on what the government does. And on this case, he's saying nay. Right? If a government is acting irresponsibly, right, then people have the right to protest that government, right? And they should not be forced to support a government they believe to be corrupt, right? The government should not force people to counter their morals and consciences. And so the best way to protest is to not comply, not support. Don't give them the taxes, don't support it. Now Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, who's a new congressman at this time, he also opposes the war, right? And he raises concern that this allows the president to just make war whatever he wants. And here's Henry Clay, who's against the war in 1847. He's a famous senator. He says, I confess that I have been shocked and alarmed by manifestations of the war in various quarters. Of all the dangers and misfortunes which could befall this nation, I should regard that of its becoming a warlike and conquering power the most direful and fatal. History tells us the most mournful tales of conquering nations and conquerors. The three most celebrated conquerors in the civilized world were Alexander, Caesar, and Napoleon. That the power of the United States is competent to the conquest of Mexico is quite probable, but it could not be achieved without frightful carnage, dreadful sacrifices of human life, and the creation of an onerous national debt, nor could it be completely effected in all probability until after the lapse of many years. Does any considerate man believe it possible that two such immense countries, with territories of nearly equal extent, with populations so incongruous, so different in race, in language, in religion, and in laws, could be blended together in one harmonious mass and happily governed by one common authority? So there's a lot of sort of moral outrage at this war. Now the Mexican War is a very one-sided affair. Under the military leadership of Zachary Taylor, the U.S. occupies North Mexico. They occupy Mexico from Santa Fe all the way over to California. California briefly becomes the Bear Flag Republic for 1 month, but that's very short-lived because they want to be part of America. So by 1846, the United States has occupied everything they want, right? They've basically occupied the vast majority of Mexico, but they want more. They want to take all of Mexico. So Winfield Scott, who's the leader of a lot of American forces, he goes down to Veracruz and captures Mexico City. And he finds that Mexico doesn't have a unified populace. There's no technology. Until 1848, the Mexicans concede, and the U.S. and Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is the treaty that ends the Mexican War and gives a huge amount of territory from Mexico to the Americans. It's a treaty where Mexico gives what they consider North Mexico to the Americans for about $15 million, which is now California, Nevada, part of Utah, part of Wyoming, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico. Polk is upset because he wanted all of Mexico, but he agrees to end the war because it's quite unpopular, and he can't afford to spend more time on war. But now the United States extends all the way to the Pacific, right? It's a small war for most of the United States, but it's big for Texas, and it's big for Mexico, which is still known as the War of Dismemberment. It's a major event in their history, sort of like the Revolution or the Civil War for them, for us. And it's going to them because it's a war. It's a war that happened because they refused to sell some land to their neighbors. That's what the war ended up being about.